"Get your filthy hands off that piano," the store manager barked. He didn't know the woman he was shouting at once taught Mozart to children in Harlem, or that the child who would play beside her would bring an entire White House audience to its feet. This is the story of how a homeless pianist and a forgotten boy stunned a nation and reminded us all what real music sounds like. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day, and drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. The polished mahogany of the grand piano gleamed under the track lighting, untouched, a centerpiece in the showroom of Willow and Bass luxury home interiors. Customers wandered through curated living spaces and ambient music hummed softly overhead until the sharp crack of a voice shattered the calm. "I said," the man barked again, louder, "get your filthy hands off that piano." Heads turned. Every set of eyes in the store was drawn to the raised platform near the center, where the source of the voice, store manager Bradley Green, known for his immaculately pressed suits and zero-tolerance demeanor, stood red-faced, nostrils flaring, hand outstretched like he was shooing a rodent. In front of him sat a small, wiry woman in a weathered gray coat. Her hair was silver, knotted messily beneath a faded knit cap, and her hands, though calloused and chapped, rested gently on the piano's keys. She didn't look up. She played. The notes floated softly at first, delicate, unsure, as though she were apologizing with every measure. But even through the hesitance, the music shimmered with something unmistakable. Elegance. Her hands moved with grace, memory, and the broken beauty of someone who once had everything, and then lost it all. But Bradley Green wasn't listening. Not really. All he saw was a homeless woman sitting where she didn't belong, touching merchandise she hadn't paid for, drawing attention to herself in a store meant for the elite. "Do you think this is your personal concert hall, ma'am?" he sneered, stepping closer, casting a shadow over her. "This instrument is worth more than whatever's in your cart under that coat. It's for sale, not for show." Still, she didn't flinch. Her name was Ruth Elkins, though no one in the store knew it yet. She hadn't spoken her name aloud in days. To most people, she was just another invisible face on the sidewalk, just someone who curled into bus stops on cold nights and watched people pretend not to see her. Today, she'd wandered in from the cold. The front doors had slid open with a hiss as she passed. Inside was warmth. And then she saw the piano. It called to her. She hadn't touched one in over a year. Not since the shelter closed its community room. Not since the street became her only companion. Not since she'd started having dreams where her fingers moved but made no sound. So when she saw this one, a gorgeous baby grand in pristine condition, crowned by a placard that read, "Do not touch," she'd sat down gently, reverently. Just a moment, she thought. Just to remember who I used to be. Now she felt the heat of 1,000 glares burning into her back. "I'm sorry," Ruth said quietly, barely above a whisper. Her hands paused over the keys. "I didn't mean any harm." Green laughed cruelly. "Harm? Lady, you're dirtying a $30,000 piano with whatever's on your fingers. If you can't afford the bench you're sitting on, you sure as hell don't belong near that instrument." A woman nearby gasped. A father ushered his son away. Some pulled out their phones, not to help, but to record. Ruth rose slowly, her knees stiff from days of sleeping on concrete. She touched the top of the piano once, lightly, like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. "It was a Chopin nocturne," she murmured. "My son used to ask me to play it when he couldn't sleep." Green rolled his eyes. Security. A burly man in a black blazer came rushing from the side entrance. "Escort her out," Green snapped. "We're not a soup kitchen, and I'm not running a homeless shelter in here." The security guard hesitated. "Brad, she didn't do anything threatening." She touched the piano. "Do your job." A pause. Then the guard gently placed a hand on Ruth's shoulder. "Ma'am, let's just step outside. It's best if we don't make a scene." She nodded silently. Her pride had already been broken long before this day. As she was led toward the doors, customers awkwardly cleared a path. No one spoke. One woman near the checkout muttered, "This is awful," but she didn't intervene. Another customer glanced up from his phone and looked away just as quickly. Just then, a chime rang from the store entrance. The glass doors hissed open. In stepped a tall man in a dark wool coat, slick with the drizzle outside. He was unassuming at first glance, but his presence shifted the air. His walk was deliberate, his gaze was sharp. He noticed Ruth immediately, the security guard, the limp, the piano. Then he turned to Green. "What the hell are you doing?" His voice was low, but it carried. Green blinked. "Sir, I'm just firing a customer in front of half the store," the man interrupted, stepping forward. "Or was it charity you decided to disgrace this time?" A murmur swept through the store. Green's voice faltered. Do you know her?" The man looked at Ruth. This truly looked as though trying to remember a melody he once knew. "No, but I know Chopin," he said calmly. "And I know when someone plays it with heart. Not many people can." Ruth's lips trembled. I'm sorry. I'll go. I didn't mean to cause any problems." "You're not the problem," the man said gently. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, handing it to her. Then he turned his attention fully to Green. "What's your name?" he asked. Green puffed up slightly. "Bradley Green, store manager." The man didn't flinch. "You've been managing this location for how long?" 5 years. The man nodded. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. He tapped something, then spoke clearly. "Sasha, yes, I'm standing at the Maplewood location. I want the keys to the store manager's office and a full employee file. Immediately." Green's face paled. "Wait, who are you?" The man turned his phone to show the logo. "Langston Retail Group." Then he smiled thinly. "Marcus Langston, owner of the Langston chain. This store is mine." Gasps exploded like fireworks across the floor. Someone dropped their coffee. Another shopper began whispering into their phone. The live streams lit up. Green's jaw opened and stayed there. "I walked in," Langston continued, voice still calm but icy, expecting to browse. "Instead, I watched a woman get humiliated for touching a piano. One she played better than half the conservatory students I've paid to hear." He turned to Ruth again. "Would you mind playing for me?" She stared at him, unsure if this was still real. I haven't practiced. Not properly. My fingers shake sometimes." "Then let them shake," Marcus said softly. "Let them play anyway." Ruth hesitated. "Then," she nodded. The guard released her shoulder. Green looked like he wanted to disappear into the marble tiles. Ruth returned to the piano. And this time, no one stopped her. The silence was a living thing, thick, holding its breath. Even the ambient store music had been silenced. All eyes were on Ruth as she stood before the piano once more, her shoulders small beneath the weight of every judgmental stare that had pierced her moments ago. Her hands hovered uncertainly above the keys, not out of fear of the notes, but fear of herself. Could she still do this? Or had time and despair finally robbed her of the last piece of who she was? Marcus Langston stood close, yet respectfully back. His posture was open, his gaze steady, not commanding but inviting, as if to say, "This is your stage now." Ruth inhaled slowly. Then, she sat. Her fingertips grazed the keys like a violinist checking for the tune in the strings. And for a moment, it looked as though she might walk away again. But then came the sound, a single note, soft, clean, then another, then a phrase. The music rose like smoke curling from an ember, hesitant, haunting. A nocturne's breath whispered through the showroom air, delicate and aching. The minor key trembled under her fingers, fragile but unmistakable. And then, she bloomed. The music poured from her hands like sunlight breaking through a gray sky. Notes tumbled into one another, cascading in perfect phrasing, precision interwoven with raw emotion. Each chord was a confession, each pause a prayer. The shoppers didn't move. Phones stayed up recording, but no one spoke. Even the children were still. Up on the second-floor balcony, a young woman in a trench coat began to cry. Quietly, as if the melody had touched something she hadn't realized was wounded. Marcus stood with arms crossed, watching not just the music, but Ruth herself. Her spine had straightened, her eyes were closed, her hands no longer shook. She looked transformed, resurrected. Flashback, 12 years earlier. In a small apartment filled with sun and secondhand furniture, Ruth had once played for her son. Every night before bed, he'd curl up beside the piano, head on a pillow, listening to Chopin, Debussy, even little songs Ruth made up on the spot, just for him. "You play like angels talk, Mama," he'd say. Those were the years of warmth and rhythm and hope. Back when her husband still worked nights at the post office. Back when she taught lessons in the local community center. Before the medical bills, before the car accident. before grief cracked her open. That apartment was long gone. Her son buried in a soldier's grave. Her husband gone 6 months later from what doctors called a heart condition. But Ruth knew was really something else. Too much sorrow, too soon. The music had gone silent after that, until today. Back in the store. The final note hung in the air like a bell at twilight. It faded, and the silence returned, and then a single clap, then another, and another. Applause burst out like thunder through the store, not polite or forced but explosive. It started with a child, then rippled through the crowd, hands clapping, some people even standing. Someone yelled, "Encore." The young man near the wine display had tears streaming down his cheeks. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard," he whispered. Ruth opened her eyes. Her hands were still resting on the keys. For a moment she looked dazed, like someone awakened from a vivid dream. Then she saw Marcus. He was smiling. Not the polished politician smile of a billionaire businessman. A real smile, proud, moved. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked softly. Ruth swallowed hard. "I was a teacher once, before everything happened." She hesitated. "My son, he was the one who kept me playing. When he died, I stopped until now." The applause softened. The moment turned quiet again, intimate. Marcus nodded. "Music like that doesn't come from training. It comes from surviving." He stepped closer. "You just played the soul of the world." Bradley Green, still lingering awkwardly at the edge of the scene, interjected. "Mr. Langston, Look, I didn't know who she was. She's not a customer. She is exactly the kind of person we should honor in a place like this." Marcus cut him off without even glancing back. Then to Ruth. "Do you have somewhere safe to sleep tonight?" She shook her head. "I was just trying to stay warm." He nodded slowly, then reached into his coat pocket, pulled out his phone again, and spoke into it. "Shelley, I need you to book a suite at the Fairmont under the name Ruth Elkins, and get her a set of clothes, warm meals, and anything else she needs. I'll send you her preferences shortly." Ruth's eyes widened. No, I couldn't." "You can," Marcus said, "and you will." He then turned to the crowd and raised his voice. "This woman just reminded us all what beauty sounds like, and what it means to be seen. That piano didn't sell today, but it did something far more valuable. It gave us a reason to listen." A reporter who had slipped in during the performance raised her hand. "Mr. Langston, are you planning to issue a statement about this incident?" Marcus smirked. "This is my statement." Then he looked back to Ruth. "How would you like to be the first artist in residence at the Langston Foundation for Music and Mental Wellness? Full salary, custom studio, and a stage that's always yours." The crowd gasped. Ruth didn't move. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice came out in a whisper. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied. She laughed, a soft, stunned, almost childlike laugh. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes." Upstairs in the manager's office, Green sat slumped at his desk hours later, staring at the termination letter that had been slid across to him by corporate. "Effective immediately," it read. A quote from Marcus Langston was printed at the bottom in bold italics. "Compassion is worth more than control, and if you can't hear the music in people, you're not fit to lead them." Meanwhile, back on the sales floor, a new sign stood next to the piano Ruth had played. "This piano is now dedicated to Ruth Elkins. Play your truth. The world is listening." Rain danced gently on the showroom windows. Outside, the sky had shifted from gray to silver, as if the world itself was recalibrating after something sacred had taken place. Inside the store, the crowd had begun to thin. But the energy remained, not just in the quiet clapping that had lingered long after Ruth's final note, but in the invisible current that still buzzed in the air like a held breath. Ruth stood near the piano, dazed but upright, her hands wrung tightly together. She looked like someone who had stepped out of a burning building and only now realized they were alive. Marcus Langston hadn't left her side. "I want you to rest now," he said gently, placing a warm hand on her shoulder. "There's a car waiting to take you to the Fairmont. Room is ready, and there's a Steinway in the suite." Ruth blinked, stunned. "A piano?" Marcus smiled. "Of course, you don't put a voice like yours in silence." From behind them, a child tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed. "Mom, was she famous or something?" The mother knelt beside him and whispered, "She is now." An hour later, the penthouse suite at the Fairmont. The suite smelled like lemon balm and fresh linen. Ruth hadn't walked on a carpet that plush in years. Her feet sank into it like the earth was forgiving her. She hesitated at the door, not wanting to touch anything. Everything gleamed. The marble counter, the polished mirrors, the fruit bowl that looked like it had been painted, not grown. On the far side of the room, standing by the arched window, was a black Steinway baby grand. She stepped toward it slowly, as if it might vanish if she moved too fast. There was no crowd here, no manager to scream, no security guard to hover, only her and the keys. She lifted the lid, pressed one note, soft, clean. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from awakening. And then she sat, and she played again. But this time it wasn't Chopin, it was her, Ruth, raw and imperfect and breathing life into every key. The song that spilled out was one she hadn't played for years. A lullaby she'd written for her son. Close your eyes, little light, the stars are here to keep you bright. Her voice cracked softly as she sang it under her breath. The pain didn't go away, but now it lived inside something beautiful. Across town, Langston HQ. Marcus sat in a glass-walled office overlooking the skyline. On his screen were a dozen frozen frames of Ruth playing, her hands, her bowed head, the way the crowd had gathered around her like moths to a holy flame. Upload the footage, he told his assistant, Sasha. Full version. Don't edit it, just title it. She played, and we finally listened. She paused. To the company page? No, Marcus said. To the world. Within an hour, the video was live. Within 3, it had been shared 14,000 times. By morning, it would hit the news cycle. Back at the Fairmont, midnight Ruth sat wrapped in a plush robe, staring out the window at the city lights. A tray of untouched tea sat beside her. She tried to sleep, but the echo of the applause, the sound of her name being spoken aloud again, wouldn't let her rest. A knock came at the door. She opened it cautiously. A young woman stood there with a parcel wrapped in navy cloth. Mr. Langston wanted you to have this, she said. Ruth took it and gently unwrapped the bundle. Inside was her old notebook. She gasped. How? It was still in your cart. He thought you might want it back. Ruth held the notebook to her chest like it was a piece of her soul returned. Thank you, she whispered. The woman smiled. Mr. Langston also asked if you'd consider performing next Friday, at the Langston Gala, as the guest of honor. Ruth's mouth fell open. But I have no dress, no shoes. I'm not. You're exactly who you need to be, the woman said, and then she left. The next morning, social media tsunami. The video had exploded. Ruth Elkins, the pianist in the rain, she played and we listened. Celebrities shared it. Musicians praised her phrasing. Music schools requested interviews. Former students wrote heartfelt posts claiming they recognized her. A viral tweet read, "We throw people away too quickly. Look what we almost lost." News anchors debated the meaning of the moment. Was this a fluke? A hidden genius? An indictment of how we treat the homeless? In every conversation, one thing was certain. Ruth's name was now known, and her music was unforgettable. Meanwhile, the man who mocked her, Bradley Green, sat alone in a dive bar 2 blocks from the store. He watched the viral video on repeat, drink untouched, face hard. The comment sections were brutal. This the guy who kicked her out. Imagine being so wrong and so loud. Hope he got fired. He had. Immediately. His name was now trending for all the wrong reasons. For the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't smirk away. Regret. Langston Foundation headquarters. That afternoon, Marcus paced the gallery, watching a dozen newly installed photos along the walls. Each one was a still of someone society had discarded. Artists, veterans, single mothers, children. Each accompanied by a line of their story and a quote from Ruth. Let them shake. Let them play anyway. He turned to his board members. We're launching the Ruth Elkins Music Fellowship. Full-ride scholarships for musicians without homes. Classes taught by working artists. A sanctuary for sound. This is no longer just philanthropy. This is justice in harmony. They nodded. Some applauded. And deep in the corner, Ruth's image, her eyes closed at the piano, beamed silently. Later that week, Ruth's first press interview. The room was warm with lights and soft laughter. A journalist leaned forward and asked, if you could say one thing to your younger self, the you before this all happened, what would it be? Ruth smiled. I'd tell her that silence doesn't mean you've disappeared. Sometimes the world just isn't listening yet. And then she added, but one day, they will. The chandeliers of the Langston Grand Ballroom hung like crystal constellations, shimmering under a wash of golden light. Velvet-draped tables circled the stage in perfect symmetry, and everywhere the air smelled of soft perfume, polished wood, and anticipation. It was the kind of night the city's elite adored. An invitation-only gala, reserved for CEOs, diplomats, and those whose surnames were woven into marble walls and university endowments. But tonight, the guest of honor didn't come from a tower suite or a Forbes list. She came from the streets. Backstage, 30 minutes before the performance, Ruth stared at herself in the mirror. The gown flowed like water around her frame, deep midnight blue, tailored perfectly. Her silver hair had been styled into a soft updo, and subtle makeup warmed the edges of her face. A single pearl pendant rested on her collarbone, borrowed from the Langston archive. But it wasn't the dress that left her stunned. It was her eyes. She hadn't seen them like this in years. Clear, grounded, alive. For so long, she'd only caught her reflection in puddles or cracked bus stop windows. Now a real mirror stared back, and it didn't flinch. A gentle knock on the door. Marcus stepped inside. "You ready?" Ruth took a breath. "Do you think they'll listen?" Marcus smiled. "They already are." He held out his hand. She took it. On stage, moments later, the room dimmed, a single spotlight ignited, and there, beneath it, stood Ruth Elkins. No one spoke. The murmuring stopped. Even glasses were lowered mid-toast. She walked with steady grace to the grand piano at center stage. A Steinway Model D, polished to perfection. She sat, adjusted the bench, her fingers hovered, then she began. This time, it wasn't Chopin, it was hers. The piece opened with a lone note, somber, steady, then layered with a gentle dissonance that tugged at the heart. A melody unfolded that carried sorrow in one hand and defiant beauty in the other. It was a song of loss, of sleeping on church steps, of cardboard pillows and whispers in the rain. But then it lifted. The tone shifted, ascending, becoming urgent, alive. It danced. It reminded the room that pain can turn into art and art into light. By the end, not a single person moved. Even the servers in the back had paused. Ruth closed with a whisper of notes so fragile they felt like breath. Then she looked up and saw him. A face from the past, front row, left side rise. He was older, broader. His hair was cut short now. The lines on his face were deeper, but there was no mistaking those eyes. Her son. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. The room spun. She blinked, looked again. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. Her son, Daniel, was gone. A roadside bomb in Kandahar. She'd buried his medals herself. But this man, his profile, the shape of his brow, the way he leaned forward with his hands clasped, it was identical. After the performance, while applause thundered and cameras flashed, Ruth remained seated, dazed. She barely noticed Marcus returning to her side. "I need to speak to someone," she whispered. Backstage, minutes later, Ruth stood in the wings, heart hammering in her chest, eyes searching the crowd, exiting the ballroom. And then he appeared, walking slowly, heading toward the exit. "Excuse me," she called out. He turned. Up close, the resemblance was even stronger, but his eyes were a different color, a soft hazel, not Daniel's sea glass green. She stammered. "Did I teach you once? Music lessons? You look—" The man hesitated. "You're Ruth Elkins," her eyes welled. "Yes, you know me? I'm Captain Jonah Reed, 82nd Airborne. Your son Daniel saved my life." Silence. "I was with him the day he died," Jonah said softly. "He pushed me out of the blast zone. Took the shrapnel himself." Ruth sank slowly onto a velvet bench. Her hands shook. Jonah sat beside her. "He talked about you constantly," he continued. "Said you played better than anyone he'd ever heard. Said your music was the only thing that made the world feel safe." A tear slipped down Ruth's cheek. "He was always scribbling your compositions in his journal," Jonah added. "After he passed, I kept it, memorized some of the melodies. Tonight, when you played, I recognized one." Ruth covered her mouth. "He wanted to send you a recording, said he was saving up for a proper keyboard. He never got the chance." From his coat, Jonah pulled out a folded notebook. Frayed, sun-bleached, weathered by time. It was filled with Ruth's lullabies, sketched in her son's handwriting. "I wanted to return this to you for years," Jonah said. "I just didn't know how." She took it with trembling fingers. "I thought the world had forgotten him," she whispered. "Forgotten me." Jonah placed a hand on hers. "We never forgot." Later that night, the rooftop garden. Ruth stood alone beneath the stars, notebook clutched to her chest, the city sparkling below. Marcus joined her, offering a glass of sparkling cider. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. She nodded slowly. "I saw a ghost tonight, then realized it wasn't a ghost at all, just a piece of my son still echoing in the world." Marcus leaned against the railing beside her. "You gave us something tonight, Ruth, something the city didn't know it needed." She turned to him, her voice soft but certain. "I thought I had nothing left, but I was wrong. I still have my music, and now, maybe even my purpose." He smiled. "And your audience." Cut to viral clip from the gala. The internet exploded again. Homeless pianist moves elite crowd to tears, then meets the man her son saved. Ruth Elkins, the gala that made history. A melody from the dead, her son's legacy lives on. Thousands more commented, millions watched. Donations poured into the Langston Foundation, and Ruth, she composed, every morning, every night. Each new piece was named after someone she met on the street, a tribute to the invisible ones who once shared her silence. The light of morning spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ruth's new studio, golden and soft, warming the wood-paneled walls and dancing across the surface of the freshly tuned piano. It had only been a week since the gala, but her world had reshaped itself entirely. The suite she now lived in was quiet, peaceful, yet alive with music. For the first time in years, she woke not to the sounds of sirens or footsteps on concrete, but to the gentle hum of the city welcoming her back. She pressed her fingers into the keys, like they were old friends, playing short scales, improvising, experimenting. Her spirit was lighter, but her playing deeper. The sorrow hadn't left her. It simply had a place to go now. The melodies that emerged each morning were no longer just a way to survive. They were a way to teach others how to breathe, and soon she would. Marcus had extended a new offer to her, to lead a special program through the Langston Foundation, music classes for youth in underserved communities. Ruth had hesitated at first. Teaching had once been her life, and losing that part of herself had nearly crushed her. But Marcus's words had stayed with her. "You didn't lose it. It was buried, and you just dug it back up." So she said yes. Langston Hall, once reserved for upscale gallery events, was now home to folding chairs, rented music stands, and young souls with cracked instruments and wide eyes. Ruth walked into the first class with nerves fluttering like birds in her chest. But the moment she saw them, 15 students between the ages of 8 and 16, each one sitting taller than the last when she entered, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. "Call me Ruth," she said warmly, setting her notebook down on the piano. "Not miss or ma'am. Just Ruth." The children smiled. They began with rhythm, clapping, tapping, learning to listen to the world. Some were shy, others were cocky, but all of them wanted to be heard. Ruth saw herself in every single one, and then she noticed the boy in the back row. He sat quietly, separate, no instrument in hand, just a worn sketchpad and a look that held more years than his young face should. His name was Miles. He didn't speak during roll call, didn't join the clapping games. Just sat and stared at the piano as if it had betrayed him once. After class, Ruth approached gently. "Miles, do you play?" The boy shrugged. "Used to. Not anymore." "Why not?" He hesitated, then muttered, "It's dumb." "No, it's not," Ruth said, crouching beside him. "Tell me the truth." He avoided her gaze. "My mom died, and I don't play anymore. That's it." Ruth felt a pang deep in her chest. "What did she sound like?" she asked softly. He looked confused. "My mom?" "No," Ruth said, "your music. When you played it, what did it sound like?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Like stars falling," he said finally. "Like the end of something." She placed a gentle hand on the bench beside her. "Would you show me, just once?" He shook his head. But the next day, he came back. And this time he brought an old keyboard. Half the keys stuck, and the speakers crackled. But he placed it carefully on his lap. That afternoon, while the rest of the class packed up, Miles sat at the side of the room, alone, and began to play. Ruth was across the hall in the office with Marcus, reviewing the week's attendance when she froze. The notes, broken, unsteady, echoed down the corridor, but there was something about them. The phrasing, the timing, the voicing of the chords. It was hers, not just her style, her actual music. She rushed into the room, heart racing, unsure why panic had started to rise in her chest. "Miles," she said, breathless, "where did you learn that?" The boy looked up. "It's just a song, from my mom's notebook." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a frayed folder. one Ruth recognized instantly. Her breath caught. She knelt slowly. "May I see that?" He handed it over. Inside were pages of handwritten sheet music, songs she hadn't published, songs she'd written on street corners, under bridges, in shelters, her signature at the bottom of each one. "I don't understand," she whispered. He shrugged. "They were hers. My mom used to sing them. Said she heard them played once by an angel in a department store when she was pregnant with me." Ruth's heart stopped. "Your mother's name?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What was it?" "Claire," he said. "Claire Elkins." The room spun. Claire. Her niece, her estranged brother's daughter. They hadn't spoken in over a decade. After Daniel died, Ruth had lost contact with the entire family. She had wandered from town to town, unaware that Claire had been looking for her. "I'm your aunt," Ruth said, eyes glistening. Miles stared at her, stunned. "What?" She knelt, clutching the folder to her chest. "Your mother, Claire. She was my family, my music. She was the only one who knew where I played when I disappeared." His voice cracked. "But she died. She got sick. It was just me for a long time." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes. "And now it's not," she said softly. He looked at her, really looked, and something broke open in him. The guardedness faded, the wall fell. He stepped forward and hugged her. She hadn't been held like that in years, and he hadn't held anyone in longer. The classroom, silent now, held the weight of generations folding into each other. Outside the window, the city moved on. Inside, two lives finally remembered who they were. The stage was smaller than the grand ballroom, but to Miles, it looked like a coliseum. The dark velvet curtain loomed behind the softly lit piano, and the quiet hum of the seated audience vibrated through the floor. He stood behind it all, half-shadowed in the wing, his fingers nervously folding into his palms. Ruth adjusted the microphone and spoke gently to the crowd. "Tonight," she said, "I want to share something personal." She wore a simple black gown, elegant and unadorned, just like her music. The light framed her like a portrait, soft around the edges. "There was a time not long ago," she continued, "when I believed the world had forgotten me. That everything I once loved, music, teaching, family, had all slipped away. But sometimes," she paused, looking into the wings where Miles watched from the shadows, "what we lose finds its way back to us in the most unexpected form." She turned to the piano. "And sometimes the person who finds us is the very melody we once gave away." A murmur swept through the crowd, curious and still. Ruth looked backstage and gave the faintest nod. Miles stepped forward. Slowly, one foot after another. His sneakers made no sound against the polished floor, but to him, each step echoed like thunder. The lights washed over him gradually, revealing a neatly ironed shirt, dark slacks, and his mother's old music folder tucked under one arm. The audience shifted, a few whispers, a few phones raised. He reached the bench and sat beside Ruth. "I'm not good at talking," he mumbled. "You don't have to," Ruth replied with a smile. "Just let your fingers say what's inside." He placed the sheet music in front of them. It was untitled, just notes. A melody his mother used to hum when doing dishes. A piece Ruth herself had written under a train bridge years ago, before she even remembered Miles existed. And now here it was again, resurrected, carried by blood and love across years of silence. Ruth struck the first chord, low, warm. Miles followed, hesitantly at first. He missed a note, then another. But Ruth didn't flinch. She wove around his rhythm, never correcting him, only meeting him where he was, like a conversation, like a lullaby being answered by a child grown older, but not grown cold. And slowly, something beautiful emerged. The melody thickened. The harmony stretched out like wings unfolding. Miles's fingers steadied, his confidence grew. His tempo became sure, his expression focused, no longer afraid, no longer hiding. He played the lullaby he barely remembered, and somehow remembered all at once. The audience leaned forward, phones were lowered, hands clutched chests. Some people closed their eyes and simply listened. By the second verse, the music was no longer just a song. It was a reconciliation, a reunion, a recognition of lineage, not just in blood, but in sound. Ruth glanced sideways. Miles was crying silently as he played. So was she. And when the final chord faded into stillness, the audience remained silent for one full breath, a reverent pause, before they erupted into applause. But it wasn't wild or loud. It was honest, long, deep, moved. Miles turned to Ruth, unsure what to do. She leaned in, kissed the top of his head and whispered, "You played like stars falling." He smiled. "That's what it sounded like to me." A music critic in the audience wrote that night, "It wasn't just a performance, it was a healing. It was what happens when two wounded souls remember they belong to each other." Backstage, Marcus Langston waited with a bouquet and tears in his eyes. "That," he said as they walked off stage, "was the single greatest thing I've ever seen in any of my theaters." Ruth shook her head. "That was all him." Miles held her hand tightly. "No, it was both of us." That night, they didn't go back to the hotel. They went home. Together. The next morning, the performance had already gone viral. Again. But this time, the headlines weren't about pity or poverty. They were about legacy. Former homeless pianist performs with her nephew and breaks the internet again. The Elkins family song, a story of lost notes, found souls, the boy who played the stars. Record labels called. Foundation offers poured in, but Ruth declined most of them. She had something more important in mind. The next week, she opened a modest music school in an old church building. Not downtown, not glamorous, but real. With scratched floors, a donation box at the door, and 5 pianos that didn't quite match. She called it Claire's Room, in honor of Miles' mother, the woman who had carried Ruth's music forward when even Ruth had forgotten it. Miles helped her paint the sign himself. And on the first day of class, as the children poured in, some carrying violins, others only hope, Ruth watched from the doorway, her heart full. She turned to Miles, standing beside her in his new instructor's badge, and said, "You know this won't be easy, right?" He grinned. "Nothing worth playing ever is." And then they walked inside. The music began again. Rain whispered against the windows of Claire's room that afternoon, the kind of soft, rhythmic drizzle that felt like a metronome set by nature. Inside, the sound of practicing students echoed through the narrow halls, discordant scales, tentative rhythms, and the occasional outburst of laughter when someone hit a sour note and tried to laugh it off. Ruth moved among them like a quiet force, correcting a fingering here, encouraging a phrase there. This was her life now, and it pulsed with quiet, sacred joy. But as she moved into the office to file some music sheets, a shadow passed the frosted glass door. It didn't knock. It opened. A tall man in a beige trench coat stepped in, his presence sharp, too rigid for the warmth of this place. His hair was slicked back with practiced precision, and a pair of cold gray eyes scanned the modest room with a mix of disdain and calculation. Ruth straightened slowly, the folder still in her hands. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice even. He shut the door behind him. "So it's true," he said, walking forward with slow, deliberate steps. "You're the woman in those videos, the pianist, the homeless miracle." Ruth's stomach turned. Something about his tone was wrong, oily, detached. "And you are?" He extended a card. The name read, Carlton Road's Estate Executor, Elkins Family Trust. Ruth's fingers tensed around the folder. "I represent the remaining legal matters related to the Elkins family estate and the guardianship of one Miles Elkins." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I wasn't aware any such matters still existed," Ruth said slowly. "Claire's will wasn't found. She passed with nothing, no assets, no record of your involvement." "That's where you're wrong," he replied, voice tight and amused. "Claire's late husband, Miles's father, had a dormant trust fund that was recently reactivated due to your resurgence." Ruth stepped around the desk, placing a steadying hand on the chair. Carlton continued, "With your recent notoriety, attention was drawn back to the Elkins lineage. That interest reawakened certain legal oversight." She folded her arms. "Say what you came to say." He smiled coldly. "Miles is technically a minor, and as such, he's not authorized to live under your guardianship. Not without a full background clearance, psychological evaluation, and court approval. Given your past status as a transient, well, that complicates things." The words landed like stones. Her face didn't move. "You're threatening to take him away," she said quietly. "Not threatening," Carlton said with a shrug. "Just informing. There are processes to be followed. And if not, well, children do end up in state care all the time. I'm simply offering you the opportunity to make the transition graceful." Ruth's eyes sharpened. Her voice dropped. "No one is taking that boy. No one." Carlton stepped closer, voice low. "You have no legal standing, no documentation. You're a story, a viral headline. But beneath the surface, you're still a woman the system forgot, and the system doesn't like being surprised. Ruth didn't blink. I've survived the system, she said, her tone steely. I've survived the streets, death, grief, hunger, shame. You think I'm afraid of a man with a folder? Carlton studied her. His confidence didn't fade, but his smirk did. You've made powerful friends, Miss Elkins, but stories fade, and when they do, so does protection. He turned toward the door. You'll be receiving a notice. I suggest you start preparing your boy. He left without another word. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum. Ruth didn't move for several long seconds. Her hands were clenched so tightly around the music folder they'd bent its corners. Her breath was shallow, measured. Miles. They were trying to tear him from her life, again. This couldn't happen. Not now. Not after everything. She looked down at the folder in her hand, and then she moved. She walked to the piano in the center of the hall and struck 3 firm notes. The room grew quiet. Students peeked from behind practice rooms. Miles appeared from the back, brows furrowed, sensing something had shifted. We need to talk, she said, her voice low but strong. That night, they sat on the couch of their small apartment above the school. Ruth told him everything, the man, the threat, the paperwork. Miles didn't cry, he didn't yell, he just asked, "What do we do?" And Ruth answered without hesitation, "We fight." They called Marcus first. He answered on the second ring, voice calm but alert. "Ruth, you're calling late." "They're trying to take Miles," she said. "They're hiding behind words and papers, but it's a game. I've seen it before. They wait until the news dies down, then they erase the story." There was silence on the other end. Then Marcus said, "I'll be there in the morning." When the sun rose, it brought a legal team. Not just any lawyers, the kind of professionals that walked into courthouses and left legacies. Ruth stood in the corner of Claire's room, watching them move like clockwork, filing affidavits, digging through every document, unearthing every truth. Marcus stood beside her. "I don't lose family," he said. And she believed him, because now, so did she. The courtroom was quiet but not calm, the kind of silence that crackled, thick with tension, eyes forward, breath held. Ruth sat at the witness table in a simple gray blouse and long black skirt, hands folded tightly in front of her. A glass of water sat untouched beside her. Every second ticked louder than the last. The judge, a woman with tired eyes and a voice like gravel, adjusted her glasses and looked down from the bench. Her robe was neat, but worn at the sleeves, the kind of wear that spoke of long days and impossible choices. "Miss Elkins," she said, voice steady, "you understand that this hearing is to determine whether you are a suitable legal guardian for Miles Elkins, age 13, and whether emergency protective custody will be granted to the petitioner, the Elkins estate executor." Ruth nodded once. To her right sat Carlton Rhodes, smug as ever in his slick suit, fingers tapping absently on the armrest of his chair. He didn't need to speak to feel like he was winning. His confidence reeked of something colder than arrogance. A belief in a system built for men like him. The judge glanced at the stack of papers in front of her. "I've reviewed the documents submitted by both parties. On one hand, we have no formal guardianship paperwork filed for Miss Elkins, no consistent income history until recently, and documented periods of homelessness. On the other hand, we have a child who, by all accounts, is thriving under her care." She leaned forward. "I'm going to ask you, Miss Elkins, to tell me, in your own words, why I should leave this child with you." The courtroom was silent. Ruth took a breath. Then she rose. Her voice, when it came, was soft, not weak, but unvarnished, honest. "I can't offer you a resume," she began. "I can't point to a perfect life with matching curtains and savings accounts. I can't even tell you that I've always been strong. Because the truth is, Your Honor, I have been broken. More than once." She glanced at Miles, sitting in the front row beside Marcus, watching her with wide, unblinking eyes. "I've lived on benches. I've begged for food. I've played piano in empty train stations just to remember who I was. I lost my son, my only child, to war, and I lost myself not long after." She paused. "But then one day I heard music again, not from a stage, from a child. A child who played the very notes I thought the world had forgotten. My nephew, my sister's son, a boy who had lost his own mother and who was carrying pieces of my soul without even knowing it." Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. "I didn't ask to become a guardian. I didn't plan it. But when I saw him, when I saw how he looked at the piano, how he played, I knew. This wasn't coincidence. This was family. This was a second chance. She took a step closer to the judge. I don't have everything, but I have love. I have music, and I have the fierce, unwavering will to protect that boy with everything I have left in me. He is not my burden. He is not my charity. He is my blood. He is my purpose. She drew a breath. I know what people see when they look at me on paper, but I dare you to look at him, to ask him if he feels unsafe, if he feels unloved, if he wants to be anywhere else. The judge looked at Miles. Miles, she said gently, would you like to speak? The courtroom watched as the boy stood slowly, small and quiet in his collared shirt. He approached the bench, hands in his pockets. He looked at Ruth, then at the judge. She saved me, he said, not just from being alone, from going numb, from giving up. She listens when I don't talk. She sees me when I don't want to be seen, and she never makes me feel like a problem. His voice trembled. My mom used to say that music was a kind of magic, and that Aunt Ruth had the strongest kind. Now I know what she meant. He looked directly at Carlton, then back at the judge. I don't want to go with him. I want to stay with her, please. He returned to his seat. Ruth's eyes were full. The judge was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke. Court recognizes the bond between Ruth Elkins and Miles Elkins. Given the testimony, the evidence of emotional stability, the absence of abuse or neglect, and the demonstrable well-being of the minor in her care, I am denying the petition for emergency custody. Carlton's jaw clenched. The judge continued. Further, I am ordering the Department of Family Services to expedite legal guardianship paperwork in favor of Miss Elkins, with immediate provisional authority granted today. The gavel came down. Ruth didn't move. Not at first. Then Miles ran to her, arms flying around her waist, head buried in her chest. She held him tightly, forehead resting on his. We did it, he whispered. No, she said softly. You did. As they walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, reporters flooded the steps. Cameras flashed, microphones extended. But Ruth didn't stop to speak, not yet. She was going home. With her boy, with her name, and with her fight behind her, for now. The envelope arrived 3 days later. Heavy parchment, cream-colored, with a gold seal pressed into the flap. Ruth found it tucked under the door of Claire's room, just beneath the welcome mat she and Miles had painted by hand. She turned it over slowly, her fingers brushing the embossed lettering, the Executive Office of the President of the United States. She stared at it for a long moment, unmoving. Then she peeled it open. Inside was an invitation. Not from a reporter. Not from a foundation or a network or a corporate sponsor looking for a viral headline. It was from the president himself. The letter was brief, handwritten, personal. Miss Elkins, your story moved a nation. But it was your music that reminded us how humanity sounds. I would be honored if you would perform at the National Education Summit in the East Room of the White House. You've inspired us. Let us give the world a stage to hear it too. Warmly, President Michael L. Grant. Ruth sat down slowly, the letter resting on her knees. Miles walked in moments later, eating a piece of toast with one hand and a sheet of homework in the other. He looked at her face, then at the letter. Bad news? He asked. She handed it to him. He read it. His eyes widened. You're playing? At the White House? We're playing, she said. He froze. Me? You and I, she nodded, her voice calm but certain, side by side. His toast dropped to the floor. The trip to D.C. happened fast. Marcus arranged everything. Hotel, press clearance, a tailored suit for Miles, and a navy silk gown for Ruth that draped like liquid shadow. The morning of the event, a presidential aide gave them a private tour of the building, pointing out portraits and antique clocks, velvet rugs older than most cities. But Ruth barely noticed any of it. Her attention was on the East Room's gleaming Steinway. Black lacquer, golden petals, flanked by 2 flags. The president met them behind the stage, sleeves rolled up, smiling like an old friend. You're making history today, he said, shaking both of their hands. And not because of where you came from, because of what you carried with you. Ruth smiled. We're just playing what was already there. An hour later, the room filled. Cabinet members, senators, teachers, students, journalists from around the world. They all sat in crisp rows beneath crystal chandeliers, waiting, expecting a moment. They didn't know they were about to witness a miracle. When Ruth and Miles stepped into the light, the room stilled. She looked over at him. He gave the slightest nod, and they began. They didn't open with a classic. No Chopin, no Beethoven. They opened with Claire's song, the one Miles remembered from the humming in his mother's kitchen, the one Ruth wrote in the years the world forgot her. It was gentle, solemn, a prayer wrapped in melody. Miles carried the opening line, tentative but warm. Ruth built the harmony beneath it, like a floor beneath his feet. Halfway through, Ruth wove in a new motif, an unfamiliar phrase she hadn't taught him. Miles glanced at her, confused. She nodded, eyes shining. He followed. The phrase grew, then repeated, then again, layered into something rich and haunting. It was Claire's handwriting. Ruth had found the loose page in the back of the old folder just days before. A melody Miles's mother had written on her own, never shown anyone. Ruth arranged it into the piece without telling him. Now, her son was playing her voice without even knowing it. And when the final chord faded into silence, no one clapped at first. Not because they weren't moved, but because they couldn't breathe. Then the standing ovation came. Reporters cried, teachers rose to their feet, the president clapped until his hands went red. And in the center of it all, a boy and his aunt sat side by side, their fingers still on the keys, their history echoing in the marble halls of power. Later, as the guests filtered out and the lights dimmed, Miles sat on the stage, legs swinging off the edge, the president's letter tucked in his coat pocket. "Do you think she saw it?" he asked. Ruth didn't need to ask who he meant. "I think," she said softly, "she's been here the whole time." He was quiet. Then he pulled something from his pocket. It was a chain, thin, worn, with a small silver charm on the end, a treble clef etched with a single letter, C. "Mom wore this every day," he said. "I thought it was lost." "I thought I was lost," Ruth whispered. They sat in silence. Then Miles placed the chain around her wrist. "You found both," he said. They returned to their neighborhood at dusk. The sky stretched out in hues of lavender and ember, the kind of evening that feels like a soft exhale. Claire's room stood quietly under the fading light, its windows glowing warmly from within, just as they had left it. But something was different. As the town car pulled away and Ruth and Miles stepped onto the sidewalk, they noticed a small crowd gathered near the entrance. Familiar faces, students, neighbors, shopkeepers from around the block. Even the coffee shop barista who'd once slipped Ruth free muffins on rainy days. In the center of the group stood a woman holding a bouquet of daffodils and a man carrying a folded sign. He saw Ruth approach and quickly unfurled it. "Welcome home, Ruth and Miles. You played for the world, now play for us." Ruth froze, her breath caught in her throat. Miles, beside her, beamed. The door opened and soft music spilled out. A delicate violin melody played by one of her youngest students, standing proudly in the entryway with a borrowed instrument tucked beneath her chin. A boy with a dented trumpet joined in, then another child with a cello scratching hesitantly at the harmony. They weren't in tune. Not quite. The rhythm stumbled here and there. But it was beautiful. They were playing the very piece Ruth and Miles had performed at the White House, Claire's song. She stepped forward, tears brimming. Did you all learn this by yourselves?" The girl with braces nodded excitedly. "Mr. Miles taught us while you were gone." He turned red. "They kept asking. I couldn't say no." The group laughed, clapped. Someone shouted, "Encore!" Inside the building, the makeshift recital area had been decorated with paper flowers, handwritten thank you notes taped to the walls, and a banner that read, "Your music is our hope." Ruth stood in the doorway, overcome. Her knees felt weak. But Miles took her hand, steady and sure, and led her inside. They sat at the upright piano, a beat-up thing someone had donated months ago. The middle C still stuck if you pressed it too hard. The bench creaked. A few of the keys were yellowed. But to Ruth, it might as well have been gold. Miles pulled out a sheet of paper and placed it gently on the stand. "What's this?" she asked. "A new song," he said. "For who?" He smiled at her. "For us." She looked down at the title. "Found." There were no other words on the page. They began playing without speaking. No need for cues. Their timing had become instinct. The melody was gentle, reflective, the notes like soft footsteps across a memory. It borrowed from Claire's song, wove in echoes of the lullaby Ruth had written for her son, and rose with the hopeful cadence of something entirely new. The audience didn't breathe. They didn't shift. No phones, no flashes, just faces lit by candlelight and reverence. And when the final note faded, no one moved, because they knew. They had just heard something sacred, not just music, a story, a journey, a promise. Outside, the street lamps flickered on, casting golden halos across the sidewalk. The city continued, unaware that in one small corner of it, 2 lives had been rebuilt, one note at a time. Ruth looked at Miles, his fingers still resting on the keys. "You brought me back," she whispered. He shook his head. "You never left. The world just stopped listening." She leaned over and pressed her forehead to his, and for a long, still moment they sat together in the quiet, not homeless, not forgotten, but home. She had nothing but calloused fingers, a coat held together by hope, and memories the world tried to erase. He was a boy carrying grief in his pocket and genius in his blood. Together they turned silence into symphony and shame into standing ovations. From a store floor to the East Room of the White House, from being judged for touching a piano to redefining the soul of a nation, Ruth Elkins and Miles didn't just survive, they composed a legacy. Because when the world stopped listening, they made it hear every single note.